This is Nick Wright here with managing editor Zachary Fillingham of Geopoliticalmonitor.com. And today we're going to talk about Afghanistan, the U.S.'s potential withdrawal from Afghanistan, and strategic considerations amongst other nations that have an interest in Afghanistan. So Zach, to start, perhaps you could just refresh our memories. Why is the United States in Afghanistan in the first place? Why are troops on the ground?
Well, it's been so long now that you could be forgiven for forgetting the original reason for the U.S. being there. Although, really, in another way, it is hard to forget 9/11. I think that this is going to be one of those historical issues that, well into the future, people are going to look back on the last coming up 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, and they might have a bit of a hard time understanding what exactly the U.S. was after in Afghanistan, whereas we who lived through the time of 9/11 and the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we still can kind of remember what the political climate was like, and it's far more understandable for us why the U.S. initially got into Afghanistan, what the objective was, and just the sort of tragic and angry soul-seeking that was going on in the direct aftermath, and because it was the first huge tragic introduction to this global terrorism, and it was such a spectacular attack that most people wanted their pound of flesh, but there was no easy route in attacking Al-Qaeda at that time. So the initial goal was to deprive Al-Qaeda of its sanctuary in Afghanistan. But that initial goal was achieved incredibly quickly in a strategic sense, right? Afghanistan withered under the might of the U.S. military pretty quickly in a matter of days, weeks. The Taliban was routed. And the next giant project started, and that was basically reconstructing Afghanistan in the United States image, or the West's image. And I think that sort of secondary goal, which the U.S. and NATO kind of bumbled towards, because I don't think they necessarily were planning to do that from the get-go. And that's the real crux of the last 2 decades, and that's the failure that we see now, is that secondary project.
And Zach, certainly in the media, the explanation given was to seek retribution for the 9/11 attacks. But what about other considerations, like the fact that the production of poppies and opium and heroin had been stopped, and access to oil pipelines, the ability to attack Pakistan on the border with the consent of the Pakistani government using airplanes. What are some of the other considerations for the United States entering Afghanistan, and what extent did they play?
Well, also 2001, another factor about 2001 that we who lived through it can appreciate is the fact that we were still in that sort of era of U.S. hubris when it came to foreign policy. So there were a bunch of, I'm sure, connected secondary foreign policy goals that they believed could be achieved in invading Afghanistan. Although I think that when we're talking about stuff like this, and just to be quick about it, there's, of course, the fact that Afghanistan is potentially lucrative source of mineral resources. It's always been geostrategically located, so it's very important for potential energy pipelines that divert Russian supply. And it's always been highly sought after, the great game in the great geopolitical chessboard of empire politics. But I think that those secondary goals were more apparent in the subsequent invasion of Iraq, more so than Afghanistan, and the diversion of resources that you saw toward Iraq after the invasion of Afghanistan is one of the many factors that kind of served to doom the nation-building process in Afghanistan.
And the fact that the United States has been in Afghanistan for so long and is now talking about pulling out, is that indication that the United States, despite preliminary success due to its military might, has in fact lost the war?
Yeah, I think it's pretty. I don't think it's controversial to say that they lost the war. I think that, to come back to the initial goals of the Afghan campaign, if the initial goal was to deprive Al Qaeda of a sanctuary, then yes, that was achieved. The war was won, but the war was won 2 weeks into the war, and then. If they left at that point and worked some sort of deal out with the Taliban at that point, then it would have been a tidy and quick operation, and it would have saved them some $1 trillion since 2001. But no, that's not what happened, as we know, and all of the money and all of the blood and treasure that was spent after that went into building a democratic Afghanistan and sidelining the Taliban from that political process. I think it's pretty obvious that venture failed, right? And now we're seeing, and that failure is complete in what we're seeing right now. And the negotiation process, which is not based on achieving the goals or the indirect, the suggested goals of years previous, which would presumably be to stabilize Afghan politics. This negotiating process is quite obviously about U.S. withdrawal in the most safe face-saving way possible, and that's it. So all of the developments that are presented as big wins by the U.S. negotiators should be treated with a fair degree of skepticism, such as the Taliban guaranteeing that Afghanistan will no longer be used as a launchpad a sanctuary for Al Qaeda, or a launchpad on third party countries by terrorist elements within Afghanistan. If those are the terms you were looking for in the negotiating process, those terms were available from the start. Like, by acquiescing to the Taliban's demands to basically sideline the government that you have been spending money on, spending blood on, and trying to prop up for 18 years, by saying, okay, we accept the Taliban precondition to negotiating, which is to ignore this government. That's, that is, that was the price of entry. That's the crow that U.S. negotiators had to eat to start this process right now. They basically turned their back on their own long-standing precondition for negotiation to get these talks going, and then they'll turn to the public and say, well, the Taliban agreed not to allow Al Qaeda back into Afghanistan. It's kind of overlooking the fact that, hey, wait a second, I thought that the Taliban was an illegitimate player in this whole political process to begin with. So that concession that they got was there from the start. The relationship between Al Qaeda and the Taliban, although it was close in 2001, and although Mullah Omar did refuse to hand over Osama bin Laden, it's not as cut and dry. It's not as simple as many people might think. The Taliban is in many ways a nationalist organization, and back then, the Taliban needed Al Qaeda for its own legitimacy and its own financing purposes much, much more than it does now. So it's a complicated situation.
And Zac, why does the United States want to withdraw now, of all times, given that it's been in Afghanistan for such a long time?
To come back to one of the themes I discussed earlier, when we're looking back in a historical sense on the war in Afghanistan, I think that, like many things, people are going to try to approach it from a rational point of view and try to understand what the United States was doing, et cetera, what they wanted, what they got. But I think that, when you're thinking about geopolitics, world politics, a lot of the time, these are leaders who are human beings making human decisions and making human mistakes, right? So they initially wanted their pound of flesh. The U.S. public demanded something to be done about this, brazen attack on 9/11, and something was done. And then after the war started, after that process of nation building started, it was very hard for all subsequent administrations to reverse what came before, and basically to admit defeat and to withdraw support from a government in Kabul that has been, if not competent, then openly corrupt on many different fronts. And that's a very dangerous political decision to make. It's very similar to Vietnam, where despite overwhelming evidence that the war is being lost, no one wants to be the one to admit defeat, and to pull out with your tail between your legs. So basically, if we can remember Obama, the first Obama campaigns, even President Obama was campaigning on pulling out of Afghanistan. And then once he became president, he looked at it and for whatever reason decided he didn't want to be the one to admit defeat. So he tried his surge, and we know now it didn't work. And so now fast forward to President Trump. President Trump, he has the benefit of his perceived outsider status, of being outside the Washington consensus, outside the military brass. He can make his own sort of Trumpian decisions. I think when it comes to something like this, that's actually that's advantageous for President Trump. He can be the leader who says, okay, this isn't working. And he'll make a peace deal that's pretty terrible. However, there's a good argument to be made that there was no other peace deal on offer, and that this terrible peace deal was always going to be the terrible peace deal, even if it came 10 years ago. It's very similar to Vietnam in many ways, where they wanted to negotiate peace with honor. Vietnamization, it's all very similar, where you're trying to build up the Afghan forces. You're trying to get a peace agreement that is all about face saving. And we know in the case of Vietnam, they pulled out and Saigon fell pretty quickly after that. And we might see something similar in Afghanistan, but and the United States will have similarly washed their hands of it by then.
And Zac, what are some of the internal politics and considerations that are currently taking place in terms of the different factions and the different interests that will play a role in the negotiation process?
Okay, well, Afghanistan is a state that has historically been ruled by a Pashtun majority, Pashtun being the ethnic group that the Taliban draws its support from. So you had a society that was previously dominated by this one ethnic group. And then when the British colonials came in the 18th century, they basically drew a line, drew the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, what we now know as Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is called the Durand Line, and it basically, by design, cleaved these ethnic groups in two to achieve the old British dictum of divide and conquer. So half of them ended up in Pakistan, if we're talking about Pashtuns, and half of them ended up in Afghanistan. Same with Balochs and several other ethnic groups. So that affected the ethnic dynamic of Afghanistan. It created a more equal distribution between Afghanistan's other ethnic groups like Hazara, Tajiks, and Uzbeks. Okay, so when you look at Afghanistan, basically Afghan politics, as we know it today, is the interplay between these ethnic groups. The Taliban previously were represented by the Pashtuns, and then the remnants of what was previously the Northern Alliance, which was an alliance of several of the other ethnic groups, who ended up with obviously a predominant amount of representation in the government in Kabul, because, as we know, the Taliban is not a part of the government in Kabul right now. So after however many years, I guess 18 years of post-war Afghanistan, you have this new political system, and they've been trying to build up a democracy. However, these institutions haven't really stuck properly, and there's still a lot of sectarian divisions of power and kind of like democratic window dressing. So there's a veneer of democratic politics, but underneath there's still the same sort of ethnic sectarian interplay that there always has been in Afghanistan. So in the lead up to, and just for example, recently you saw a stark example of the internal politics of Afghanistan kind of lining up for the post-NATO reality in the Russian talks in Moscow last week between the Afghan opposition and the Taliban. And the civilian government in Kabul wasn't even represented, right? So these talks are kind of appear to be a precursor to some kind of jirga or interim government that will be set up and then draft a constitution and then hold elections and then incorporate the Taliban into the system. But all of these ethnic groups are armed. They all have their own sort of militant base. And it's an open question as to A, when the Americans withdraw, when the 14,000 some odd U.S. troops are out of the country, what's going to happen? And B, whether the civilian government has... Actually, this isn't even a question. The civilian government has a serious problem when it comes to legitimacy, right? When the U.S. is gone and that sort of veneer of civilian government in Kabul collapses, the question is what's going to happen. And I think that odds are you're going to see a return to some kind of civil war type situation.
So you're predicting civil war after U.S. withdrawal?
I mean, like, I hope that's not the end result, but it appears to me that the negotiations are based on getting, like from the Taliban point of view, the negotiations are based on getting the U.S. forces out of Afghanistan. After the U.S. forces are out of Afghanistan, you have, basically no one who can keep the peace between these various sectarian groups. And I mean, so then it becomes an article of faith. Do you believe that the Afghan Taliban, who are this, for all intents and purposes, extremist Islamist group, born of the Mujahideen, who, perpetrated all sorts of blood-curdling human rights abuses that made it into headlines the world over even before 2001, do you think that they're going to turn around and start, as they were trying to push them to do in Moscow last week, just guarantee the honoring of basic human rights? I don't know. Hopefully, but unlikely in my opinion. And then it becomes who has the military assets in Afghanistan. The Taliban obviously have proven they are capable of being a fighting force against this civilian government in Kabul, backed by the U.S. NATO presence. So after NATO is gone, it's basically, it comes down to whether you believe that the Taliban will just accept a negotiated solution with the other sectarian interests in Afghanistan. And you know what? It's possible. I mean, it's like we can get the attrition rates from the Afghan government, the Afghan National Security Forces that are just bleeding soldiers have an insane attrition rate of, by late 2018, it's 57 Afghan policemen and soldiers a day being killed in attacks. Obviously having a disastrous effect on morale and a disastrous effect on overall troop levels. One could assume that there's comparable attrition being inflicted on the Taliban. Obviously, it's happening behind the scenes. We can't see it. They don't publish their official numbers. But so maybe that will be a motivation on their part to in this process where they come together in a jirga or whatever happens, and they try to create a new political order, maybe they will have some good faith there to participate in it because of the just the disastrous impact of the last 18 years of war.
And Zach, the differing levels of military might and demonstrated military ability, will that likely lead to one group like the Taliban taking over the country, or will it likely lead to a new arrangement where different factions control different regions of the country?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the latter is more likely, personally, because, like I said, the fighting capability of the Taliban must have been substantially impacted by decades of fighting, and in the post, it's a kind of another open question. The post NATO order, who will be supporting which faction, and whether, say, Pakistan or even Russia would be brazen enough, confident enough to sort of up their level of material support to the Taliban. Obviously, something that would not make any friends in Washington, but I think definitely either or of those situations could occur. Also, it's always hard to tell exactly how these things are going to play out, because you might have a situation where the new political order is constituted and for a while actually accepted, and then that political order breaks apart in the years to come, and then the process of that breaking apart will affect the dynamics of the subsequent conflict. So. Yeah. I think, but it is possible either one.
And what are the interests of other nations like Pakistan and Russia that may be more pertinent with U.S. withdrawal, and what's the likelihood that other interested countries may start to play a role with the U.S. Removing its troops from the country?
Well, I mean, like, this is another way that you can sort of see the lack of an overriding U.S. goal in Afghanistan by comparing U.S. policy in Afghanistan to the policy of some of the other big regional players like India, Russia, Pakistan, even to a lesser degree, but increasingly China. So it's pretty obvious at this point that the U.S. is on the way out, right? And it's been kind of obvious. The writing's been on the wall for the last year or so. So in that period, you've had some of the other regional players stepping in and trying to make preliminary steps to reassert their, what you would call maybe historical interest in Afghanistan. So one of them is Pakistan, obviously. Pakistan has been a big thorn in the side of the U.S. over the whole course of the Afghan conflict. The way that things are panning out right now, I gotta say, Pakistan's foreign policy towards Afghanistan looks like a winner. I mean, they never really removed their support for the Taliban, and they never really fully played ball with the United States. So now that the political process is a big mystery, the post-war political process is a big mystery, but we know the Taliban will be a big part of it, presumably. So the Pakistan still have their horse, and they still have their ability to achieve quote-unquote strategic depth in Afghanistan, which is the policy of trying to massage Afghan politics in a direction that is contrary to Indian interests, basically keep India from gaining a substantial foothold in Afghanistan. So there's Pakistan, and basically, we have an article that goes, we have a series of articles on the website that goes through country by country, sort of running down all of their interests in Afghanistan and how these interests are coming to the fore again now that NATO's on the way out. But I think one thing that's interesting to note here is that with regards to Pakistan and Afghan relations, they were not close countries historically. The colonial era division of the two states has previously been a huge obstacle in Afghan-Pakistan relations. Afghanistan initially opposed Pakistan joining the United Nations in 1947. The two countries almost fought a war in the 1970s. Most of this has to do with Pashtun nationalism and the possibility that you might have a pan-Pashtun movement in those borderlands that could affect the territorial integrity of the Pakistan state. So Pakistan, since the USSR invasion of Afghanistan, the Mujahideen era, has tried to use religion as the sort of uniting force that directs pan-Pashtun solidarity away from the possibility of some sort of self-determination in the Afpak borderlands. But interestingly, it's still a problem. There's still protests in the Pakistan side of the borderlands in Pashtun areas. I was actually reading on Dawn the other day, which is a Pakistani newspaper. It's flaring up again. So there's that. Pakistan will always be there, always be competing with India. India is an interesting one because India really went all in on the U.S. conception of the post-NATO or the post-war order, which is basically to completely ignore the Taliban and to delegitimize them as a political actor in Afghanistan. So now that the Taliban are coming back, India doesn't really have a solid in with them, so it has become a big question mark for India how they are going to interact with whatever political order is to come. And that's a big problem because India invested some $3 billion into Afghan reconstruction. India has been a big supporter of the reconstruction effort, and India has been hoping, the hope of the Indian foreign policy establishment was that this war would create a situation whereby India could sort of assert its interests in Afghanistan and not necessarily use Afghanistan as a chip against Pakistan, but that is there. But India has considerable economic interest in Afghanistan, and if it could create the conditions for a government in Afghanistan that could stabilize and police the Afpak borderlands such that they're not creating militant groups that eventually infiltrate into India-administered Kashmir, that would be a huge security plus for India. So that's what they were going for. There's a lot of interesting trade dynamics that are outlined in some of the articles. Basically, Afghanistan, as we know, is a landlocked country. But as some of you might not know, its trade has been dominated by Pakistan for a long time. Most of the sort of critical trade infrastructure, mostly highways, goes through Pakistan down to Karachi port. So basically, Pakistan has had a large amount of leverage over Afghanistan in trade matters, economic matters, and it's definitely used that leverage to its political advantage at times. But now India is trying to assist in Afghanistan diversifying its trade. And mostly this is through the Chabahar port in Iran, which we also have another backgrounder up on. And that's kind of like the central hub of, basically, generally speaking, India's equivalent to China's Belt and Road, which is the north-south transport corridor. And they've met with limited success so far. There's been a huge amount of Afghan trade is diverting away from Pakistan and through this Iranian port.
And what about Russia, Zach? What interest does Russia have that it may try to advance with U.S. withdrawal?
Russia, as we know, obviously the inheritor of a bitter legacy in the form of the Soviet Union war in Afghanistan, which ended in 1988. you wouldn't think that Moscow would be a natural partner to the Taliban, since the Taliban is a sort of factional remnant of the Mujahideen, which once upon a time drove the Soviets out of the country. But over the last couple of years, as like I said before, the writing has increasingly been on the wall of a U.S. withdrawal. Moscow has obviously been looking to its future interests in Afghanistan, and it's just simply a few broad interests it has is to stabilize the country. Obviously, because it's not because Afghanistan itself is critical to Russian foreign policy, but because it borders Central Asia, which is a critical region to Russia. It wants to stop or control drug trafficking routes out of Afghanistan. As you mentioned before, Afghanistan's the opium growing heartland. So ideally for the Russians, they would have a government in Afghanistan that can exert some kind of control over narcotic production.
Which would be the Taliban.
Russia is also presumably it would be the Taliban. And I think you mentioned something that is is important to note. I mean, like, for all of the terribleness that the Taliban displayed in their rule, all of their sort of human rights violations, they had begun to crack down on opium production, because obviously narcotic production doesn't square with fundamentalist conceptions of Islam. So so in that sense, Russia, the Taliban kind of make a natural partner for Russia. And also, sort of as an aside, I'm sure that Moscow is thinking about the possibility of future arms sales to the Taliban as well, which wouldn't hurt. I mean, there's already been rumors that that's been happening. So, and Russia is also a party to both Belt and Road and North-South Transport Corridor. So, the Putin administration would like to see Afghanistan stabilized and incorporated into those regional trade efforts, because both would benefit Russia as well.
And what kind of timeline do you expect the U.S. to act on? How are the negotiations going, and when will they likely come to something meaningful? Or how motivated is the United States to withdraw on a prompt timeline?
Well, I think there was one leak that was 18 months for a withdrawal schedule, withdrawal timeline. So the entirety of U.S. forces would be withdrawn in 18 months, whenever that process begins. It was subsequently denied by U.S. officials, but there might be some truth in it. I think it's hard to say. I think it's going to be quicker rather than slow. It's going to be. I think that by the end of Trump's term in office, he's going to want to, if not like set the process rolling, then definitely have that start date solidly put down. Because I think it's going to be something he'll go to the electorate with as following through on his promise.
And what impact would U.S. withdrawal have on its stature in the world domestically? Will this be seen as a loss reflective of a decline in U.S. power?
I know, you tell me. Yeah, I would think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say that in all likelihood, we won't hear much about it in the media, or at least not in a meaningful way. So in a sense, it will feel as if there's no impact. But I think most certainly amongst those who pay attention and have an interest in geopolitics and global affairs and military, that this is certainly another indication that the U.S. increasingly doesn't have the ability to impact the world in ways that it hopes to. And part of it is the lack of a clear objective, as you spoke about earlier, Zac, and also a changing objective with different groups having different foreign policy ambitions as governments change. But yeah, I think that this, along with many other small events and indications, doesn't look well for the United States and its ability to impact the world.
Oh well, I mean, like this is totally, in my opinion, it's the end of an era in a way. I mean, like when you look at the tenure of negotiations with the Taliban, you put yourself in the Taliban's shoes. You know that once the U.S. pulls out, it would take an act of God to get U.S. troops back into Afghanistan. So from a negotiating point of view, you just need to get them out. Whatever happens after that, whatever sort of faux and flimsy political orders in place, it doesn't matter because you know they're not coming back. And in that sense, it really is the end of an era. I mean, you said the U.S. cannot sort of impact events in the way it wanted to. Yeah, that's true. I mean, like the U.S. will always be, and it still is, obviously, outweight very important, huge military budget, etc. But it definitely, when they pull out of Afghanistan, it is indicative of changing times.
It's a new American century, but perhaps not in the way previously envisioned with the...
Oh, nice. That's nice little old school Bush talk. Yeah. Well, I mean, like, pull up that document and read that document. I mean, that'll tell you everything you need to know about how the world has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. I mean, the whole neocon project is not panning out.
Zac, is there anything else that you think that we should cover to fully understand the potential U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and how that will have an impact on both Afghanistan and the region?
I think today, no. I think it'll be interesting to come back to it when we see the specifics of the withdrawal agreement. But I think until then, we can say with confidence that, I mean, they got one foot out the door already, and I wouldn't be surprised if they accepted an agreement that, for example, just set up an interim government and then took the guarantee of no foreign parties operating in Afghanistan and just said, okay, 18 months, we're gone.
Interesting. And to our listeners, as Zac mentioned earlier, there's a series of articles on the website on both Afghanistan and the interests of different countries in Afghanistan. So if you want to learn more about the issue and read up in depth, you can check out the website at Geopoliticalmonitor.com. So Zac, thanks so much for speaking with us today. I found it very interesting and informative. And to our listeners, thanks for listening, and talk to you next time.